The channel is now at over 500,000 subscribers, which is just an insane number. It seriously continues to blow our minds that this many people enjoy what we do here, but we're so thankful for it and that we get to continue making these videos and talking about the topics we love. It's incredible to see how many people have an interest in paleontology, evolution, and the natural world, and we're very happy that we get to educate so many on these fascinating subjects. As has become our tradition, to celebrate this amazing milestone, we're going to be taking a look at what our own planet Earth was like 500,000 years ago in the Pleistocene epoch, and the non-human animals and hominins that were around back then, as well as the climate and physical geography of the time. And yes, we are kind of very late to the video this time, and we'll try to get to the 600,000 one quicker, but at least we got round to it eventually. Anyway, let's explore our world 500,000 years ago. As usual, let's start with the non-human animals that were around at this point in Earth's history. The Pleistocene world was full of some amazing and wondrous creatures, and slowly, episode by episode, we seem to be covering a fair few of them. Here we'll be exploring one extinct animal from every continent except Antarctica, as we do in each video. So let's begin our journey in North America, with the American Mastodon. The American Mastodon is potentially one of the most well-known of all Pleistocene animals, and for good reason. A great deal of fossils from these creatures have been found all across the North American continent, showing that this was a very widespread and pretty successful species. The actual species we're talking about here is Mammuth americanum, the first fossils of which were recorded in 1705 when a farmer in the state of New York came across a large tooth, which was at first considered to have come from some kind of biblical giant. Eventually, in 1799, a German naturalist gave these animals the genus name of Mammut, arguing that, based on the more complete remains of these animals that had since been found, these were potentially bones that came from mammoths, which he also named that same year. The name Mastodon actually originates from the French naturalist Georges Cuvier, the founding father of paleontology as he is known by some, who in 1817 gave them the genus name Mastodon, meaning breast tooth, based on his observation that the crowns of their molars had nipple-like projections. Please don't get us demonetized, Cuvier, thanks. Anyway, this name was later realized to be invalid since Blumenbach had already given them a genus name almost 2 decades prior. So Mastodon ended up being a common name used to refer to the animals, not their official scientific name. The older idea that mastodons were a kind of mammoth has long since been overturned too, as it's clear from their anatomy that they differed in many ways to these other animals. They were still proboscideans though, the same order of mammals that includes the living elephant group. However, while mammoths were placed in the same family as elephants, Elephantidae, mastodons are a bit more distantly related, in the family Mammutidae, branching off from other proboscideans sometime around 27 million years ago. Generally, the American Mastodon had a fairly similar overall body plan to other proboscideans, such as modern elephants and mammoths, though notably they were more heavily built than mammoths, had much shorter legs, relatively longer bodies, and possessed shorter and less curved tusks. Additionally, the shape of their molar teeth were very different, having those nipple-like projections as we've already seen. Another interesting difference that's been the subject of quite a bit of discussion in more recent years is the extent of hairy integument in mastodons. As pointed out by a couple of researchers and summarised very nicely in a blog post by paleontologist Mark Whitten, there's been a trend in paleoartistic reconstructions and indeed in academic work on mastodons that perpetuate the idea of these animals being covered in a thick woolly coating of hair, just like that's seen in their mammoth relatives, despite there not actually being any evidence for this and potentially some evidence against it. I'd recommend reading the blog post if you're interested and for more details, but basically all the early evidence for mastodons supposedly having a thick coat of hair is based on fraudulent claims of soft tissue preservation that have since been disproven, as well as some misidentified apparent hair that turned out to be dried algae. However, these claims were all made in the 1800s, and since then some actual verified evidence of mastodon hair has been found. Unfortunately, it's not as good as you'd hope. In the 1980s, a few short articles containing a scanning electron microscope image of just one single mastodon hair were published, and that's still all we have in terms of direct evidence in the published literature. This apparent mastodon hair sample comes from the cranium, but unfortunately this is potentially one of the least useful places to have a hair sample from in order to tell us about the rest of the body's integument. This is because in living elephants, the face and head is one of the most vulnerable locations to cold temperatures, meaning it's expected that mastodons would have had hair here anyway. So what about the rest of the body? Putting it simply, there's a good reason to think that a mammal the size and mass of a mastodon would actually be struggling to shed heat, especially given that this was not an extreme cold-adapted animal like its woolly mammoth relatives. Mastodons did not inhabit the colder regions of North America during glaciations, instead sticking to more southern localities and living in wetter woodlands, and also have features of their anatomy, such as relatively long tails, that indicate they weren't particularly specialized for cold climates. So a mastodon covered in a thick coat of hair would probably overheat, leading some to suggest that these animals probably had a reduced covering over most of their bodies, similar to what we see in modern elephants, though whether or not the hair was lost to the same extent can't be said for certain. It's also possible that the amount of hair loss varied from population to population depending on where they lived, but for now that's speculation. It's assumed that mastodons, like mammoths and modern elephants, probably lived in small herds of females and their offspring, forming what are known as mixed herds. Once males reached adulthood, they then left these herds and lived by themselves or in bond groupings with other males. The feeding habits of American mastodons have been well studied, with a lot of work being done on their ecology and dietary preferences. A study examining the carbon and oxygen stable isotopes of various extinct proboscidean fossils found that mastodons showed a distinct preference for enclosed areas, such as forests, and only consumed C3 plants, meaning they were browsing, not grazing animals. Another study which looked at the patterns of microwear on the teeth of mastodons from various different times and places across Pleistocene North America found that these animals did actually display some plasticity in their diets, with a population in Florida that inhabited a cypress swamp habitat displaying a different diet to more northern populations that lived in open pine parklands or boreal forests. Talking about the distribution of these animals, the American mastodon had an incredibly wide range across the continent during the time in which the species existed, living as far north as Alaska during times of interglacials, as far east as Florida, and as far south as central Mexico, though they never made it into South America. However, an interesting recent discovery has actually changed our understanding of this species' distribution. While it had been thought that Mammoth americanum was also an inhabitant of Pleistocene California, research published in 2019 showed that all supposed M. americanum fossils found in the state, as well as a few from Idaho, actually differed significantly in various aspects of their anatomy, indicating that they were in fact members of a different species. Named Mammoth pacificus, these Pacific mastodons had narrower teeth, more sacral vertebrae, and a few other notable differences that enabled researchers to identify them as a unique species, and show that, interestingly, the American mastodon has not been found in California, perhaps meaning that a population of these animals became isolated here and evolved into a new species, giving rise to the Pacific mastodon. The American mastodon is therefore a fascinating and iconic resident of Pleistocene North America, and it'll be interesting to see what future research reveals about these incredible extinct animals. Moving down south now, we come to South America. No surprise there. Again, during the Pleistocene, this vast and diverse continent was home to a fantastic range of prehistoric organisms, particularly unique in this case due to the millions of years of isolation that the continent had experienced before the Great American Biotic Interchange started around 2.6 million years ago. One of the unique groups of animals that evolved in the isolated South American continent were the notoungulates, a clade of mammals that has a fairly controversial and debated relationship to other lineages, but that are most likely placed within the ungulates or hoofed mammals, according to recent research. Within the notoungulates, a group called the toxodontids evolved and actually became the only lineage of these South American mammals to survive right until the end of the Pleistocene. Toxodontids have often been superficially compared to rhinos in their overall shape, an interesting case of convergent evolution, and the most well-known member of the group, Toxodon itself, is famous for having been first recognized by Charles Darwin during the voyage of the Beagle when he encountered its fossils in Uruguay. But another toxodontid that was around 500,000 years ago was Mixotoxodon, a lesser known genus that is actually unique among all notoungulates for being the only one we know of so far that actually made it into North America during the Great American Biotic Interchange. Named in 1957 based on fossils from a collection in Venezuela, Mixotoxodon would also have looked quite rhinoceros-like in its overall appearance. The name itself was chosen by the paleontologist who described it based on the observation that the lower dentition mixes characters of two subfamilies, hence Mixotoxodon, meaning mixture toxodon. Another remarkable thing about the Mixotoxodon genus is that a study published in 2012 found that this was likely the largest member of Notoungulata known to us. Using various predictive equations based on measurements and comparisons of different bones, they found a huge range in dimensions among the Notoungulates, but discovered Mixotoxodon to have had the greatest mass of any, at 3,797 kilograms. So this was a very hefty animal. The different shape of the snout in Mixotoxodon compared to Toxodon, being more elongate instead of broad, also suggests that they were feeding in a different way to their relatives, which would make sense considering the different ranges they inhabited. In 2013, a paper was published announcing the first ever discovery of a Notoungulate in the United States. The fossil that had been discovered was a single tooth from Texas, a left upper third molar, that quite clearly came from a Toxodontid. Closer examination of the specific details of the tooth further confirmed that this indeed came from Mixotoxodon itself, extending the range of the Toxodontids an incredible 1,600 kilometers north from where they were previously known to have lived. So Mixotoxodon is an intriguing and very important member of this amazing South American lineage, and it really does deserve to be better known than it is. It'll be very interesting to see if more discoveries in its northern range are made in the future. There's definitely a lot more to learn about these remarkable organisms. Hopping across the Atlantic now, we arrive in Pleistocene Africa. Yet another continent full of spectacular creatures living at this time. The one we're going to be looking at here is an animal called Megalotragus. Megalotragus was a kind of bovid and a member of the grouping known as Alcalaphinae, which today includes animals such as the wildebeest, hartebeest, blesbok, and a few other antelope, though note that antelope is a very general term. This extinct genus, which existed in the Pliocene epoch and one species of which actually survived until the Holocene, was a particularly big alcalaphine, with estimates putting the largest species standing about 1.4 meters tall at the shoulder. In overall body shape and anatomy, it's been noted how Megalotragus closely resembles the wildebeest, leading to some paleontologists referring to this taxon as the giant wildebeest. Examination of the specific bone characteristics of Megalotragus reveals a lot of similarity to the black wildebeest of South Africa, Lesotho, and Eswatini, particularly in the way their horns curve, in their teeth, and in the bones of their forelimbs. Previously, a great deal of similarity between the skulls of Megalotragus and living hartebeest had been noted too, resulting in some relationship to these alcalaphines being considered as well. However, closer inspection of the similarities has shown that they are likely the result of convergent evolution, and not an especially intimate relation to each other. An interesting aspect of Megalotragus anatomy is the apparent importance of vision to its lifestyle, as this bovid had particularly pronounced orbits, likely enabling the animals a better view as they watched out for potential predators. Enough specimens of this genus are known for evidence of sexual dimorphism to be recognized too, with females having more gracile horn cores and a gentler curvature to them than those identified as male. This more robust construction of the horns, in addition to evidence of protuberances near the bases and the generally more horizontal orientation of these structures, have been taken as also suggesting that male Megalotragus were highly territorial and presumably used their horns in intraspecific combat. The similar overall shape of the horns to those of aurochs is proposed to be more evidence that these bovids were quite aggressive animals. Based on the evidence gathered from their skeletal anatomy and reconstructions of their lifestyle, these were therefore probably bovids that were adapted to a highly specific grazing niche in open grasslands and that became very territorial when large herds formed. Another relatively little known but fascinating Pleistocene inhabitant of our prehistoric world, Megalotragus would have been an awesome creature to see in the flesh. As we travel north to Europe to see what sorts of animals were living here during the Pleistocene, we come to some more bovids. An incredibly widespread species that lived from the early Pleistocene up until just over 5,000 years ago was the steppe bison, Bison priscus. Now, as is usually the case when we cover prehistoric animals that lived in Europe at this time, the steppe bison was not restricted to this continent alone. In fact, a so-called Great Pleistocene bison belt was present across the world, with the species stretching from the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles all the way across Asia and into North America, reaching as far south as Mexico. These beasts were incredible animals, and clearly very successful in the time they existed on Earth, dominating the environments of Eurasia. Interestingly, a lot has actually been determined about their external anatomy and appearance thanks to ancient artworks found in caves, as well as the discoveries of frozen mummified bison from Russia and Alaska. Overall, steppe bison would have looked pretty similar to the still living American bison and European bison, or viscent, though a 2016 paper examining the anatomy of a mummified individual from Yakutia in Russia found that it shared some features of the spine and its hair colour and patterns with the living American wood bison. Standing around 2 meters tall at the shoulder, steppe bison were scarily big animals, but not actually the largest bison to ever exist, with that title instead going to a descendant of theirs, Bison latifrons. This giant bison could likely have reached a height of about 2.5 meters at the shoulder and had absolutely enormous horns. There's actually some good evidence for how exactly the steppe bison evolved over the course of its existence on Earth, with 3 different subspecies being identified. The oldest, from the first part of the mid-Pleistocene, is Bison priscus gigas. This subspecies also happens to have been the largest, with a distance from the tip of one horn core to another of an astonishing 2 meters. In the second part of the mid-Pleistocene then lived Bison priscus priscus, which had a slightly smaller tip-to-tip distance. Finally, in the late Pleistocene was Bison priscus mediator, the smallest subspecies of the 3. It's been suggested that the smaller size in the younger subspecies might have had something to do with evolutionary changes associated with the appearance of the European bison, or viscent. Indeed, a hybridization event between steppe bison and the ancestors of modern cattle, the aurochs, has been suggested to have been how European bison originated, although different research has found that European bison are probably not directly descended from the steppe bison, leading to some disagreement on their origins. As the steppe bison was so widespread, it's no surprise that it has been depicted in ancient rock art. In fact, 820 depictions of bison are known in Paleolithic cave art, making up a significant percentage of the animals represented in European rock art. These bison paintings are actually quite variable in their appearance, which was assumed for a long time to be due to different cultural and individual interpretations. However, a very interesting paper published in the journal Nature in 2016 offers a different explanation for the variety in depictions. Instead of this mainly being due to cultural or personal artistic style, this research suggests this was a real biological difference in the anatomy of the animals they were illustrating. 2 distinct forms of bison could be identified from the cave art, a version that had longer horns and looked similar to a living American bison, and another that had smaller horns and body proportions much more like those of European bison. So what was going on here? Well, this artwork, along with evidence from ancient mitochondrial DNA and analyses of nuclear DNA, is used to support the idea that the European bison is the result of a hybridization event between steppe bison and aurochs. According to this research, sometime before 120,000 years ago, there was a hybridization between these 2 lineages that eventually gave rise to the viscent, meaning the forms looking more like American bison are showing true steppe bison, whereas the other forms are actually showing European bison. Additionally, it seems the artwork recorded the ecological replacement of the steppe bison by the viscent in Europe, after the last glacial maximum about 22 to 18,000 years ago, with viscent paintings becoming much more common than steppe bison ones after this time, which is pretty fascinating and again demonstrates the importance of studying rock art. Another interesting piece of artwork illustrating these animals is the so-called bison-looking insect bite carving, a chunk of a broken spear thrower that's made from reindeer antler that shows a steppe bison turning its head to lick an injury on its side. Discovered as a site in France and likely carved about 15,000 years ago, it's another interesting indication of the apparent cultural importance these organisms had for ancient humans. As I mentioned briefly before, some astonishing mummified frozen specimens of steppe bison have been found too. Not only is there the Yakutia individual from Russia, but also one that was discovered in Alaska in 1979 and nicknamed Blue Babe, after the folklore of Paul Bunyan and his giant blue ox Babe. This steppe bison was actually stained a bluish colour due to a kind of blue iron phosphate that formed from reactions with the silt the individual was buried in. Blue Babe is also significantly older than the individual from Yakutia, dating to about 36,000 years ago, compared to the age of 10,500 years for the Russian animal. This specimen is also unique for being the first steppe bison that humans have tasted for thousands of years, as the researchers who were responsible for preparing the specimen for display decided, for whatever reason, to cut out a section of the preserved flesh, stew it, share it out between them, and eat it. For science, I guess. Anyway, steppe bison were again some awesome animals that definitely would have been incredible to see in person. And thanks to the remarkable mummified specimens, we can actually get a pretty good idea of what they would have been like. And now we move on to the continent renowned for being home to some of the weirdest of all prehistoric animals, Australasia. 500,000 years ago, there was a very unusual animal inhabiting Australia. Well, actually there were quite a few, but the one we're talking about here is Procoptodon. This oddly terrifying looking creature was a genus of short-faced kangaroo that lived during the Pleistocene and includes a number of different species, with the most well-known and one of the latest surviving species being the giant Procoptodon goliah, which, to be completely clear, was not actually around 500,000 years ago and instead lived later on in the Pleistocene, but the Procoptodon genus as a whole existed at this time, so we're going with it. This large-bodied species stood about 2 meters tall, though in some places the estimates range up to as much as 2.7 meters, but this seems to be a slight overestimate. And it had a mass of around 240 kilograms, so these were pretty enormous for kangaroos. However, the Procoptodon genus was actually quite diverse in the body size of the included species, with Procoptodon gili reaching much smaller dimensions. In overall appearance, Procoptodon would have looked fairly similar to modern kangaroos. However, certain features of their anatomy were notably different. As members of the grouping known as Sthenurinae, the short-faced kangaroos, which are all extinct today, this marsupial had a distinctly short skull and eyes that were oriented in a more forward-facing position than modern kangaroos, lending an almost primate-looking appearance to the face of Procoptodon. The lower jaws of the prehistoric kangaroo were also remarkably huge, and a lot of bone fusion occurred in the dentaries, even resulting in a chin forming at the front end. The incisors were fairly small, whereas the molars also seemed to be very primate-like in their structure, with specific comparisons being made to the teeth of the robust Australopithecine species Paranthropus boisei. More interesting anatomical details of Procoptodon include the fact that they possessed 2 particularly long fingers on each hand that had very elongate and curving claws on the ends of them, suggested to be an adaptation to aid the kangaroos in pulling high up vegetation down towards them. Potentially helping with this mode of feeding is that the arms of these animals were also very long and mobile. But if you thought that the front limbs were weird, just wait until you look at the back limbs. Like a lot of the living members of the kangaroo lineage, digit 4 on the foot is the largest one, and the other digits are reduced. However, in Procoptodon, this was taken to the extreme, with the surrounding digits having become so reduced that this kangaroo was essentially just moving around on one massive toe on each foot, similar to the condition in modern horses in a way. Except at the end of Procoptodon's toe was then a massive claw, not a hoof. The bones of these single toes were relatively wider when compared to the same elements in living kangaroos, helping to provide the animal with more stability as they had to compensate for the loss of the side digits. So then, how exactly did these extinct kangaroos move about? Well, in the case of the giant Procoptodon goliah, which again was the largest and one of the latest surviving species of the genus, and so this might not apply to all species of Procoptodon, there's actually been quite a lot of research and debate. Although it was initially assumed that Procoptodon would have moved about like modern kangaroos, wallabies and wallaroos by hopping, because, you know, it's a kangaroo and that's just what they do, it turns out that looking at the details of their biomechanics, this was probably not possible for them. A paper published in 2014 analysed various morphological aspects of extinct sthenurine kangaroos and compared them to the conditions in other members of the kangaroo family, known as the macropods. What they found was that parts of their anatomy would restrict them from performing what is known as pentapedal walking, a type of locomotion when the tail is utilised as a fifth limb when modern kangaroos move at slower speeds. Plus, they completely lacked a whole load of features associated with fast hopping. Instead, sthenurines such as Procoptodon displayed anatomical characters consistent with supporting themselves relatively upright as they walked, in addition to supporting their body weight on one leg at a time. All this evidence led the researchers to propose a method of locomotion for the giant sthenurines in which they had a bipedal striding gait, as hopping was just not a viable method for them. It's a very interesting biomechanical study that does make a lot of sense when you consider just how large these animals were, and how differently that must have forced them to move. Some interesting investigations into the diet of these extinct kangaroos have been done too, though again mainly focusing on the giant Procoptodon goliath that lived later than 500,000 years ago. This research has looked into the skull and jaw anatomy of these animals, stable isotopes in their bones, and data on the microwear on their teeth, discovering that Procoptodon was a specialized browsing animal, not a grazer, and probably favored salt bushes. The kangaroos would then likely have used those elongated fingers and arms to pull the leaves of these plants closer and feed on them. The Procoptodon genus, and especially the youngest and largest of them, Procoptodon goliath, was yet another fascinating and incredible organism that once inhabited our world. These strange animals, so similar and yet so different to one of the most iconic living mammals of our time, would have been amazing creatures to encounter. Finally, our safari across the planet 500,000 years ago brings us to Asia. This vast continent was home to a stunning variety of fascinating extinct animals, just as it is filled with remarkable living ones today. Here though, we're going to be taking a look at an interesting kind of extinct crocodilian, called Toyotamaphimeia, a genus that lived from around 800,000 to 300,000 years ago. The first remains of this crocodilian were found in 1964 in Toyonaka City, Japan, at a construction site of part of Osaka University. This was the first time that a fossil crocodilian had been found in Japan, and similarities with the modern-day Falsgharial were observed, and as such it was named as a new species within the Falsgharial genus, Tomistoma macacanense. In 1983, another paleontologist re-examined the fossils of this crocodilian and found that they were actually more different to the Falsgharial than had been previously appreciated, having a pretty unique dentition. So it was then given its own genus name, and called Toyotamaphimeia macacanensis, after Toyotamahime, a goddess in Japanese mythology who transforms into a crocodile. This crocodilian was a pretty big animal, possibly reaching over 7 meters or 24 feet long, with a very long slender snout filled with massive teeth, and a total length of the skull of over a meter. This type specimen of Toyotamaphimeia is an impressive fossil, with a well-preserved skull and most of the body, lacking some limbs and parts of the tail. It's still classified as a close relative of the Falsgharial too, being placed within Tomistominae within Gavialids. Something very interesting was noticed on this specimen though. The front third of the lower jaw is missing, but there are signs of healing at the end, meaning the mandible was amputated during life and the animal survived for a while after. Looking at other parts of the skeleton, there are fractures on the right tibia and fibula, and also puncture marks on one of the dermal scutes, a bony plate in the skin. All of these various injuries were healed to some extent, and this particular Toyotamaphimeia clearly lived for a while with a large section of its lower jaw missing. However, considering that living crocodilians are known to survive with some pretty horrific injuries, it makes sense that these extinct crocodilians were just as hardy. The most likely cause of these injuries was suggested by paleontologists to be due to a fight with another Toyotamaphimeia, since adult members of this species were likely too big to have faced much of a threat from any other animals, with no larger predators yet known from the same time and place. Fighting between modern adult male crocodilians is well documented as they compete for mates or territory, and you can imagine the damage that another massive Toyotamaphimeia could have inflicted. Plus, the bite marks on the scute match up pretty nicely with the teeth of this crocodilian. They also suggest that the different injuries might represent a few different separate conflicts, since crocodilians generally flee a fight once dominance has been asserted, and so the many injuries in different places could be from several encounters. It's a testament to the resilience of this individual, and crocodilians in general, that this Toyotamaphimeia survived so many severe wounds, and the preservation of these injuries on the fossilized bones provides an amazing insight into these reptiles' behaviors. More remains of Toyotamaphimeia have also been found in Japan in the years since the holotype was first uncovered, including more skull material and parts of the body skeleton. There have also been some very recent developments in Toyotamaphimeia research, with a paper published in June of 2023 actually naming a second species, this time in Taiwan. This paper reassigns a species formerly called Tomistoma taiwanicus to Toyotamaphimeia taiwanicus, based on 6 specimens comprising various pieces of skull and jaw fragments, and representing at least 2 individuals. The species likely lived between 800,000 and 400,000 years ago, and is particularly interesting in representing a tropical species of Toyotamaphimeia, whereas it had previously only been known to inhabit relatively high latitudes in Japan, putting it near the lower thermal limit for crocodilians when they were existing here during the Pleistocene. Toyotamaphimeia taiwanicus, however, shows that they were spread down to lower latitudes as well, and the paleontologists hypothesized that perhaps Toyotamaphimeia actually originated here in this more tropical region, evolving a large body size, which then enabled the reptiles to later disperse further north as they had a gigantothermic physiology that would have buffered them against lower average temperatures. So Toyotamaphimeia would have been another fantastic, if slightly scary, animal to have come across 500,000 years ago. It must have been quite spectacular to watch 2 massive 7-meter long crocodilians battling it out and ripping off bits of each other's jaws. And once again it shows how amazing our world was 500,000 years ago. Well, there we have it, a selection of some of the animals that you might have encountered 500,000 years ago if you were to travel across the continents at this time. Next up, Ollie will be taking a look at what the climates and environments would have been like, before Doug explores some of the human species that were roaming around at this time.
Once again we are talking about climate, and this may be a bit repetitive because I'll be repeating a lot of what has already been said in previous subscriber specials. That's because over the second half of the Quaternary period, the general trend is that glacial periods are on a roughly 100,000 year cycle, and so seeing as we are currently in an interglacial, 500,000 years ago was also an interglacial. 500,000 years ago is rather special within the Quaternary period, as it marks the start of a new period of much more pronounced and extreme glacial fluctuations. Confusingly, different countries and areas have different names for the same periods of glacial advancement. What is called the chroma stage or chroma complex in northern Europe was occurring. This was a period from around 800,000 years ago to 500,000 years ago, in which there was a noticeable decrease in glacial activity, a period of some advancements and retreats, but all small scale and mere fluctuations. The reason why glaciations are referred to by different names is because not all areas of the world with glaciers experience the same patterns of advances and retreats. For example, in the Alps at the same time as the chroma complex, the Gunz complex is occurring, which saw around 5 glacial cycles within it, which only very roughly correspond to the cycles within the chroma. But it does seem that generally all glaciations were weaker than after 500,000 years ago. Please remember that glacial cycles are not an exact science, and all of these trends are very generalized. 500,000 years ago, roughly speaking, was still an interglacial, but it was the very tail end of the chroma stage and preceded what is called the Elster glaciation in northern Europe. The Elster glaciation is one of the most extensive glacial periods that occurred, with ice sheets almost joining up with the glaciers in the Alps. Why is it on a cycle like this? Well, the best explanation we have is Milankovitch cycles, though this is not an exact science, and there are some issues with them as an explanation for glacial cycles after 800,000 years ago. The mid-Pleistocene transition is the switch from a roughly 41,000 year cycle to the 100,000 year cycle. The 41,000 year cycle can be explained easily with obliquity being on that timescale, as it affects the intensity of the sun's radiation on the northern hemisphere during winter, but the 100,000 year cycle is still unknown. What I'm about to say next is simply a theory. Eccentricity is the shape of the Earth's orbit, being either more circular or more elliptical. Obliquity is the tilt of the Earth on its axis, and precession is the wobble of the Earth's axis. Now, eccentricity is on a roughly 100,000 year cycle, and 500,000 years ago it was in a similar shape to how it is today, being very circular and nearing almost circular. This is one reason why the Earth is currently interglacial, and why 500,000 years ago it was also an interglacial, as for a glacial period to occur it needs very elliptical orbits. This may seem counterintuitive, as a more elliptical orbit means that the perihelion of the Earth's orbit would be rather close to the Sun, and therefore getting a great amount of insolation, surely making things hotter, but again it's more complex. The other 2 Milankovitch cycles are crucial as well, as it is the culmination of all of them that can cause a glacial period. When the precession of the Earth's orbit causes the northern hemisphere winter to coincide with the perihelion of the orbit, while the obliquity of the Earth's axis is at its smallest angle around 22.1 degrees, that's what can cause a glacial period. This is because at less less of an angle, there is a small decrease in the intensity of insolation reaching the surface, and therefore a milder temperature. The reason that it has to be winter at the perihelion, which seems like it would melt the ice, is because overall these cycles don't cause that much of a change in the overall amount of radiation. So even at the perihelion, most of the winter ice won't melt. What's important is that ice builds up, so what is required is for the snowfall in the winter to survive until the next year, until it builds up properly, and so having the summer at the aphelion and being very mild means the snow can survive the whole year round. This can then cause glacial expansion, which then causes cooler and cooler temperatures as the high albedo of the ice will reflect more and more radiation as the ice sheets and glaciers expand, eventually snowballing into a glacial period. This is the thing with glacial periods, they are incredibly delicate and can be triggered by the smallest change in the amount of solar radiation, and that's why some scientists have proposed that anthropogenic climate change may delay or even stop the next glacial period, is even though this may seem drastic, the level of carbon in the air and even just a 2% increase in global temperatures can massively overshadow the effects of solar radiation on the planet's natural cycle. We could be in perfect orbital conditions for a glacial period, but the global temperatures simply overshadow the tiny changes in solar radiation that trigger the snowball effect that leads to glacial periods. This has obviously happened before in the Earth's lifespan, as the Earth has been orbiting in this way for many millions of years, but the higher temperatures of the Earth at the time made the Milankovitch cycles obsolete. It's only been in more recent millions of years that the Earth has cooled enough for there to be a permanent ice sheet and glaciers on the planet's surface that allow for the tiny changes in orbit to cause such events as glacial expansion. The carbon content of our atmosphere is currently around 420 parts per million, which is vastly higher than it has been in the past 500,000 years, which is when the regular 100,000 year cycles of glacial periods started. So this theory really isn't all unreasonable. People just don't really realise how delicate the Earth is and don't realise how finely balanced the small causes of glacial periods are. That's why an increase of just 2 degrees matters, and equally why it's theorised that if we employed space mirrors, the reduced insolation of the sun's rays by a mere 1%, we could counteract climate change. The whole thing really is just that finely balanced. But space mirrors are rather unfeasible, and we should probably just focus upon sorting things out down here. So 500,000 years ago, it was an interglacial period, mainly due to the Milankovitch cycles not aligning correctly to cause a glacial period. But given another roughly 20,000 years and the conditions become suitable for the Elster glaciation. On graphs it may seem like it was because of the high carbon content in the atmosphere at the time, which in some ways it was. The high carbon content was due to warmer temperatures, and therefore greater rates of respiration by plant life and animals, which added to the snowballing effect, increasing temperatures, so increasing plant life, etc, etc. Positive feedback loops are the key to understanding the Ice Age. So what does this mean for the rest of the planet's geography? Well, you may remember from previous episodes that interglacial periods are generally wetter than glacial periods, as there is more water in the air and oceans due to less being stored in the ice sheets. This means not only higher sea levels, but also things like more intense storms, deserts retracting in size, and even higher rates of erosion due to more rainfall. There is a current climatic theory that this can actually be a negative feedback loop to try and stabilise the warming effects of an interglacial period, as that increase in moisture in the air means heavier rainfall, especially in mountainous areas like the Himalayas, where relief rainfall and monsoons occur. This causes minerals to be eroded from the rocks of the Himalayas and wash down the river deltas, causing algae blooms in the Bay of Bengal where it's deposited. These algal blooms mean more CO2 taken out of the atmosphere and sequestered in the deep ocean floor when the algae dies and sinks to the bottom. This then obviously would mean less CO2 in the atmosphere, which may counteract the warming climate. This is just one interesting little effect that it has, and its overall impact on the climate is still being debated, but it's just a cool little system that makes up the amazing science of climate change. Now you may be wondering how we know the climate was interglacial 500,000 years ago, and the answer to that comes in many different forms of indicators called proxies. The first proxy we can talk about is ice cores, large thin bores of ice drilled into ice sheets to test the types and concentrations of gas bubbles that have been frozen in them over hundreds of thousands of years of ice buildup. Now, understanding ice cores is quite easy to climate scientists because of the law of superposition, which is a pompous way of just saying the depth of the sediments, or in this case ice, corresponds to when they were laid down. So you can see exactly the time the ice was laid by how far down the ice core you look. So looking 500,000 years deep, we can then look at what gas bubbles have been frozen there. A high relative concentration of CO2 and methane bubbles means it was a warmer climate. and a higher concentration of oxygen isotope 18 than normal will also be seen in the ice. Because remember, an interglacial period doesn't mean that there aren't still glaciers and ice sheets present. Conversely, in ocean and lake sediments drilled from the same time, you'll see a slight decrease in the relative concentration of oxygen 18. This is because simply, if it's warmer, the heavier isotope oxygen 18, obviously when bonded with hydrogen to form water, can be evaporated at higher rates from the water and go into the air where it may get frozen in the ice sheets. In colder times, you'll simply find less oxygen 18 in the ice, and the concentration in lake and ocean sediments will be slightly higher than in an interglacial period, because at a lower temperature there isn't as much energy to evaporate the heavy isotope bonded water. You can then also look at the lighter oxygen isotope 16. Being lighter, it is more active in the water cycle. During an interglacial period, as it's evaporated and then precipitated, some will obviously go into the ice, but due to there being less ice coverage, much more of it will simply flow back into the oceans and lakes, meaning there will be a higher concentration of it in the sediment present than in a glacial period. In a glacial period, more of it will be captured in the ice sheets, and so the concentration in the water and therefore the sediments decreases. Now, ice cores have a limit, and that limit is 800,000 years, because that is about how long the oxygen isotopes last. So anything beyond this is very inaccurate and hard to tell from ice cores. But fear not, because we have another proxy to use that extends back millions of years: foraminifera. These are tiny microscopic fossilized plankton and are great proxies because they form shells made of calcite that trap CO2 in them. So by looking at the concentration, we can estimate the climate. We can also study their distributions and concentrations, as they are living organisms that find it hard to survive in very cold climates. We can see that at depths that correlate to cold years, they aren't found as northerly as they are in warmer years. All this points to one explanation, that 500,000 years ago was an interglacial period. It lines up correctly with the Milankovitch cycles, the ice cores, and the foraminifera. Now on to Doug's section on human stuff.
500,000 years ago was an interesting point in human evolution. But like the entire history of our species' evolution, it's also a complicated and contentious time. Homo sapiens itself had yet to appear, with the oldest fossils so far assigned to anatomically modern humans dating to about 315,000 years ago at a site in Morocco, showing that anatomically modern humans had already made it this far northwest across the continent by this point in time, after likely originating further south in Africa. So, 500,000 years ago, the lineage leading to Homo sapiens was up and about, along with a few other species within the genus Homo. Additionally, recent evidence has suggested that the divergence between the lineage that eventually led to Neanderthals and Denisovans had potentially split from the lineage leading to our species by this point. Plus, the far-reaching Homo erectus was still alive, surviving until just over 100,000 years ago. So, 500,000 years ago was definitely a fascinating time for humans. If you were to travel back to this time, you'd encounter a strange mixture of archaic humans descending from even more ancient human radiations. You might meet some of the earliest Neanderthals as they spread across Europe, and the Denisovans as they dispersed across Asia, and, back in Africa, a particular lineage of Homo representing your very own ancestors. Of course, some of these Neanderthals and Denisovans may very well have been your ancestors too, considering how much interbreeding between all our species happened later on. So, let's take a look at the evidence we have for what humans were up to 500,000 years ago, and starting off with Homo erectus. This fascinating species is a complete and utter taxonomic mess, with continuous debate over what should or should not be defined as erectus, and a very wide distribution of fossils potentially attributable to it. Having originated probably about 2 million years ago, and potentially surviving up to just over 100,000 years ago, you can begin to understand why there's been a lot of discussion about what should be included in the species. I could speak endlessly about Homo erectus and its complex history and numerous controversies, but to keep things relatively simple, let's just look at what we know they were doing 500,000 years ago. Well, firstly, we know that by this time they'd spread vast distances across Asia, into Europe, and were also potentially present in Africa, depending on whether or not you agree with the distinctiveness of Homo ergaster, which has been argued to represent the African lineage of Homo erectus. There's also still discussion over whether erectus represents a lineage that evolved in Africa and then spread out to Asia, or if it descends from a more ancient Homo habilis grade hominin that migrated out of Africa, speciated in Asia, giving rise to erectus, and then dispersed from there. I did warn you, it's a mess. Homo erectus generally was a fairly large-bodied hominin compared to most archaic members, but their size also varied a great deal across their geographical range, with estimates for different specimens ranging from around 4'9" to 6'1". Erectus possessed a relatively large brain held inside a thick, large skull with a pronounced brow ridge, and their bodies were also quite robust and heavy, especially compared to later members of Homo. We know that Homo erectus was a toolmaker, as the remains of this human species are often associated with the Apulian cultural complex, a type of stone tool industry known for its distinctive hand axes and large flakes of stone. Erectus is also often associated with butchering sites of large animals, notably elephants, leading some researchers to suggest that Homo erectus was actually particularly reliant on elephants and may even have disappeared from areas when elephant populations died out. For example, in the Levant, 400,000 years ago, elephant fossils disappeared from the fossil record at the same time that there's evidence for Homo erectus being replaced by a new hominin in the region. It also seems that Homo erectus was potentially creating controlled fires by this time too, with some possible evidence hinting that this species was cooking their food about 780,000 years ago in the Levant. However, the habitual use of fire seems only to have become more widespread after about 400,000 years ago. Incredibly, there's also a possibility that Homo erectus was making engravings on freshwater mussel shells around this time. At the type locality for Homo erectus on Java, Indonesia, where the first fossils of this hominin were discovered, a fossilized mussel shell was found that displays an engraved geometric pattern. Dating the sediment contained within the shell, researchers found it to be between 540,000 and 430,000 years old, and they associate the unnatural geometric pattern with erectus. Although there's no way to know what these engravings might mean, or if they could even be art, it's very interesting and shows that Homo erectus had the cognitive capability to create abstract patterns such as these. Unfortunately, life for Homo erectus wasn't always so relaxed and full of chilled shell carving sessions. We also know that these hominins suffered from some pretty awful diseases, with direct evidence of tuberculosis meningitis affecting an individual living around 510,000 to 490,000 years ago in Turkey. The frontal bone of the skull displays characteristic lesions on the inner surface that resulted from an inflammation of the meninges likely caused by tuberculosis, representing the oldest example of this disease in a hominin. Another interesting occurrence of what might potentially be Homo erectus about 500,000 years ago is the so-called Toyotamaphimeia. This is again somewhat contentious, however, as the identity of this species has been heavily debated, and they may in fact represent Homo heidelbergensis instead, and therefore may be along the lineage that eventually led to Neanderthals. Indeed, a very recent publication from 2023 finds them to group with the non-erectus members of Homo genus, so just keep that in mind. The fossils of these hominins, whatever they may be, come from the Arago cave in Toyotamaphimeia, southern France. Excavations have been going on there since the 60s, and in that time, hundreds of human bones have been uncovered in various beds ranging from 550,000 years ago to about 400,000 years ago. The evidence from the cave shows that these humans were hunting animals and bringing them back here to be processed and butchered, and that over time, the particular prey preferences of the cave inhabitants changed. There are also some hints of possible cannibalism among these people, with certain hominin bones showing the hallmarks of being processed by stone tools. The relative abundances of certain elements hint at anthropogenic selection, with certain localized sectors of the cave preserving mainly skulls, mandibles, lower limbs, and pelvic girdles, and showing these indications of processing by tools. Researchers have therefore suggested that maybe this was a kind of ritualistic cannibalism of the recently dead, however, and not cannibalism for survival, as it seems they weren't eating the entire bodies. Instead, they may have been mainly going for the brains, tongues, and fleshy lower limb muscles. The idea has also been proposed that perhaps this cutting of specific regions of the bodies was symbolic for these people in some way, or perhaps even done out of curiosity to see what was inside the bodies of members of their own species, since this behaviour has been suggested in Neanderthals living much later, and therefore, if the Tautaval hominins are indeed related to Neanderthals, this could be a behaviour that was happening for a long time in this lineage. So certainly some interesting social practices occurred among these early European members of Homo about 500,000 years ago. Another incredible site of great importance that, at least parts of, date to around 500,000 years ago, is that of the Atapuerca in northern Spain. Atapuerca comprises an extensive cave system, with several locations and beds within the caves dating up to around 1.2 million years ago, and others dated to about 430,000 years ago. During this time, there appears to have been pretty much continuous occupation of the cave system by hominins. However, the identity of these hominins changed over time, with the possible presence of Homo erectus or the contentious species of Homo antecessor in the older sediments, and then the remains of what are most likely Homo heidelbergensis and also early Neanderthals in the more recent deposits. The more recent hominin bones come from a particular locality in Atapuerca called Cima de los Huesos, meaning the pit of bones. These remains have been dated at over 530,000 years old, but more recent estimates are more confident that they date to around 430,000 years ago. This site has played a particularly significant part in working out when Neanderthals and the Denisovans split from one another, as the mitochondrial DNA, which is only inherited from an animal's mother, was recovered from a specimen and found to be closely related to the lineage leading to the mitochondrial genome of the Denisovans. This confused paleoanthropologists at first, as it had been assumed that the later hominins at Atapuerca were somewhere along the lineage leading from Heidelbergensis to Neanderthals, but these results were suggesting a Denisovan affinity. A few years later though, researchers managed to recover nuclear DNA from a couple of other specimens, which showed that the hominins in the pit of bones were in fact related to Neanderthals. The discrepancy between the mitochondrial and the nuclear DNA appears to be because Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA only turned over later on in their history, long after these early Neanderthals, and possibly due to gene flow with populations in Africa, replacing particular mitochondrial DNA sequences, therefore making it seem at first that this population was closer to Denisovans. The results also indicated something else very interesting though. Since these remains were dated to around 430,000 years ago, and the genetic information showed that these were already early Neanderthals distinct from Denisovans, it means that these two human populations must have split from one another before this time. Estimates for the divergence time between these two ancient humans have varied a great deal, with some earlier calculations based on the recovered genetic information putting it at just 381,000 years ago, but then this contrasts with the older age of the already distinct Atapuerca Neanderthals. Later estimates using different techniques have produced older dates, timing the splits to 744,000 years ago, which would then be consistent with the identity of the hominins in the pit of bones. So, about 500,000 years ago, it's likely that the Neanderthal and Denisovan lineages were distinct from one another, and potentially had been for over 200,000 years. That didn't mean they weren't interacting with each other though. We know that Neanderthals and Denisovans continued to interbreed with one another for a long time after, as shown by the remains of a young girl who lived over 50,000 years ago and had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She was a first-generation hybrid, and the fact that we've been able to find one when only a relatively few archaic hominin specimens have had their genomes sequenced indicates that this was probably a pretty common event, so it's conceivable that it was happening 500,000 years ago too. Both Neanderthals and Denisovans later interbred with Homo sapiens once they encountered them as well, as we can tell from the traces of these ancient humans in the genomes of modern-day people. But what were our own ancestors up to 500,000 years ago? The exact species of Homo that ended up giving rise to Homo sapiens has been an intensely debated subject within paleoanthropology. A possible candidate, based on our current understanding, is potentially Homo heidelbergensis, or at least something somewhat like it. Heidelbergensis has been suggested as the last common ancestor between Homo sapiens, Denisovans and Neanderthals, or alternatively as a chronospecies, leading just to the Neanderthals. There is still much discussion about this. The Heidelbergensis has also been suggested by some authors to have most likely originated in Africa and then had some populations dispersed to Eurasia, while others stayed on the continent. Alternatively, some argue that it originated in Eurasia from a population of Homo erectus and then dispersed back into Africa. The classification and validity of Heidelbergensis as a whole is a particularly messy part of human evolution, so we'll try and keep it simple. Anyway, our own ancestors were potentially somewhat similar to these humans, if not descended from a population of Heidelbergensis itself. So what were they getting up to 500,000 years ago? Well, we know they were also tool makers, and had been for a very long time. A locality in South Africa that has been dated to approximately 500,000 years ago preserves some of the oldest evidence for blade technology production characteristic of the Pharesmith industry, the sort of proposed intermediate stone tool industry between the older Acheulean and the younger Middle Stone Age. Although the creators of these blades cannot be determined for certain, this type of stone industry is roughly associated with the appearance of Homo heidelbergensis. The tools themselves show that these blades had been systematically produced using direct hard hammer hits, and then extensive preparation of the blade cores by flaking bits off. Some of the blades were then further fashioned into sharp points. So, this was clearly a fairly complex process, and interestingly actually varies from the strategies employed to produce blades at another similarly aged site in Kenya and a slightly younger locality in Israel. This could therefore indicate that these hominins were independently starting and then adapting their blade production techniques to suit the particular areas they were inhabiting, and might also indicate that blade technology among hominins had multiple different origins, but this idea needs further testing. Homo heidelbergensis had of course also made its way pretty far north by this time, braving the different climates of Northern Europe and even making it as far as the UK. Older hominin excursions to England are known, as indicated by hominin tracks found in Norfolk that potentially date to over 800,000 years ago, and have been attributed to the more ancient Homo antecessor, suggesting that multiple waves of early human dispersals to Northern Europe took place over many hundreds of thousands of years. 500,000 years ago, one of these phases of northwestern European occupation saw hominins making it to Britain again. At this point, Britain was still connected to mainland Europe by a land bridge, meaning these humans could have walked the whole way there. At a location that today sits around 10 kilometres to the north of the English Channel shoreline in West Sussex, a few bones attributed to Homo heidelbergensis have been recovered, along with more than 300 stone tools, as well as evidence of a prehistoric butchery site. This site, called Boxgrove, would have been at the base of a large chalk cliff 500,000 years ago and was situated on a coastal plain. The sediments record a period of human occupation over tens of thousands of years, during a temperate interglacial period that then turned into a cold stage. The chalk from the cliff would have supplied these hominins with plenty of flint for constructing the many hand axes found here, which were used to cut the flesh off the bones of deer, bison, horses, and even rhinos, the remains of which have all been uncovered at Boxgrove and display characteristic cut marks from stone tools. Incredibly, the exact places where these hominins seem to have sat down and produced their stone tools can even be seen at Boxgrove, as concentrations of debitage, the small flakes that come off the larger stone while it's shaped and made smaller, are preserved in the same spots where they fell around 500,000 years ago. It's not clear if these hominins were just scavenging these animals or actively hunting them, though there is a horse scapula with a puncture wound that appears consistent with a projectile weapon, providing evidence for at least some hunting. The actual hominin remains that have been found here include a tibia and 2 isolated lower incisors. The incisors seem to belong to the same individual, and display some pretty nasty injuries, as the roots of the teeth seem to have been exposed at their fronts during life, indicating repeated trauma to the gums and remodelling of the tooth tissue due to large forces applied to them. The teeth also display many tiny pits and scratches across their surfaces that seem to have been caused when this individual was holding meat or other materials in its jaws and using a stone tool to cut it, but the tool appears to have occasionally slipped or penetrated too deep and ended up scratching the teeth. Amazingly, due to the preferred orientation of scratches, it can be determined that this individual was right-handed and using this hand to cut whatever they were holding in their mouth. The tibia from Boxgrove is also particularly notable in being relatively huge for an early human. The owner of this bone would have probably stood at around 5 foot 11 inches, pretty large for a human around this time, and the thickness of the bone indicates that this was quite a stocky individual. They must have been fairly heavy and very strong, necessary for the tough lifestyle they would have had, and the notable robusticity of the leg bone might suggest that perhaps this population had body proportions that had adapted to the colder northern climate, similar to what's seen in Neanderthals. Since the hominin remains from Boxgrove are so scarce, they can't be said with certainty to come from Homo heidelbergensis, but it is the most likely candidate based on the timings and proposed distribution of the species. Whoever the Boxgrove humans were though, they certainly seem to have had challenging lives filled with dental discomfort, but were also incredibly prolific butcherers of large animals and expert toolmakers. Something else we should probably also look at is the very recently published evidence for the structural use of wood by hominins around this time. Published in September of 2023, this research has shown that hominins, at a site called Kalambo Falls in Zambia, were deliberately cutting and modifying logs of wood to construct some kind of architecture at least 476,000 years ago. Even older evidence of the use of wood is known from 780,000 years ago, at a site in Israel, where a fragment of polished plank was found. So 500,000 years ago, at least some hominins seem to have definitely been utilising this resource to modify their environments. Kalambo Falls is a waterlogged site, meaning there was a lack of oxygen in the sediments, which allowed the wood to be preserved for so long, and it's likely that the use of wood to build structures was potentially more widespread than we realised. It just doesn't preserve very well over hundreds of thousands of years. The wood structure at the locality in Zambia is made up of 2 interlocking logs that are joined where an intentionally cut notch is present in the upper one. Scrape marks from tools are present all across the surfaces too, showing that these logs were definitely processed by hominins, an incredible discovery showing that these ancient people were apparently building sizable structures this far back in time. The exact purpose of the structure is obviously very difficult to determine with any level of certainty, but the researchers hypothesize that perhaps it may have formed part of a walkway or raised platform above the wet environment of the site, or it may even have been a section of a habitation structure that these hominins lived in. The species that created this structure also cannot be determined with certainty, but it dates back to before the earliest Homo sapiens appear, and so might have been constructed by the sapiens' ancestor, or possibly a different lineage. So there we have it, a brief look at what our hominin ancestors and relatives were likely getting up to 500,000 years ago. Obviously, this is a very condensed, simplified view of the state of hominin evolution at this time, as it's such a complicated topic and we could go on forever discussing all the various controversies. And I'm sure future discoveries will make some of this outdated soon enough. Hopefully though, you've enjoyed this snapshot view of the human world back then. Well, that's it for our 500k special. Yeah, it was really rather late, but we've been very busy going through uni and completing our degrees. Ben and I have just graduated, which means, once again, we have a lot more time for YouTube, which we're both very excited for. But we've both learned a lot at university. Over the past 3 years, we've both understood our degree subjects a lot more, with Ben studying paleontology and myself studying English and history. But perhaps even more importantly, we've both met a great number of wonderful and talented people that are very keen to lend their hand to making this channel even better. We're hoping to expand the channel into new avenues of media and expand across different social media platforms. We're also really looking forward to using what we've learned in our short film The Traveller to create higher budget productions as well. This will all help diversify and increase the quality of the content we're able to bring out to you. For everyone who has supported the channel in any way, whether you've been with us all the way from the beginning or whether this is your first video, thank you for for being here and supporting us. We really have been able to achieve some of our dreams thanks to what this channel has brought us, and we are so excited to share what those dreams allow us to create with you.
I also just wanted to say that we have now introduced channel memberships, a feature on YouTube that allows you to support the channel and become a member, where you can then gain access to exclusive members' content for a monthly payment, kind of like Patreon. We've got lots of exciting plans for it, including posting behind the scenes bonus videos of our fossil hunting trips, trips to museums, and whatever else you'd like to see. Plus members only live streams at least once a month, where we can casually chat about recent paleontological discoveries and go through papers together, and probably also discuss my own research for my masters. There will also be plenty of polls for members to vote in, deciding on future topics for videos and streams, and I'm looking forward to interacting with everyone who joins. It should be really fun, and I hope it's something people will like. We've just got the 1 tier for now, the Jurassic tier, but we're open to adding a lower Triassic tier and a higher Cretaceous tier if people would like more options, and please do let us know your feedback and ideas for what you'd like to see. Our aim is to make this as worthwhile as possible for members, so please do tell us what you most want out of it. I'd also like to thank everyone who has become a member so far. It really means a lot to us that you're willing to support the channel like this, and I hope you've been enjoying the bonus videos that are up already. Anyway, thank you so much everyone for watching, and once again thank you for continuing to support us and getting the channel to over 500,000 subscribers. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.